Mochi Health is here to help you start your weight loss journey with caring, personalized support. Meet one-on-one with board-certified obesity doctors and registered dietitians who truly listen and understand your unique needs. Eligible patients can access affordable GLP-1 medications delivered right to their door each month. No insurance? No problem. Mochi Health accepts FSA and HSA, making care accessible and affordable. And with 24/7 customer service, you'll never feel alone on your path to better health. Get started with Mochi Health today. Take the free quiz at joinmochi.com and use code AUDIO40 at checkout for $40 off your first month of membership. That's joinmochi.com with promo code AUDIO40.
I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my haunting co-host, Brett.
Ooh, and Alice, I gotta tell you, I am so excited about this episode. This is maybe the most excited I've been at least since October. Definitely.
I think if you could compare my excitement about our Taylor Swift Legal Briefs episode, this episode is tailor-made for Brett, and let me tell you why. We are here today with an incredible guest. We have Ryan Buffet with us, who is the creator, the host, and the producer of the Exorcist Files. If you guys have not listened to the Exorcist Files, you need to go to your podcast app right now and hit subscribe. And there's so much more to come. Now, some of you may be thinking, legal briefs, what does this have to do with exorcism? If you guys remember, on the Prosecutors podcast, in our very first year, then our first 6 months, one of our most popular episodes was, you remember, Roland Doe, the exorcism that was behind the Exorcist movie. And that was based on the Catholic Files. We've often talked about things on legal briefs and also in the prosecutors about the interplay of true crime or crime in general and mental health and kind of psychiatric realm of the world. What is the line between psychiatric world, mental health world, true crime, and maybe the spiritual realm? You know, some may say there's really not a line whatsoever. And so I welcome Ryan. Ryan, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you for having me. Y'all see this creepy shadow that I'm casting up on my ceiling? For all
terrifying.
people, if anyone gets to watch this, I just want you to know there is some sort of, it's not intentional. There's some sort of cool 3D effect going on where I'm being mirrored by some sort of malignant entity above me.
Totally
Well,
appropriate.
isn't that a great lead into what we're here to? Okay, Ryan, we have such a diverse listener base. A lot of people here do kind of listen to the Exorcist world, but for those who don't know, what is exorcism? Who does it? Is there, are the Lutherans who do it? Is it just the Catholics? Who does it? And how did you get into making an entire podcast series on exorcism?
Absolutely. Exorcism is something probably a lot of people are familiar with from just the cultural pieces of content that have come out, particularly the movie The Exorcist, which terrified millions of people and, interestingly enough, plummeted the sales of Ouija boards and helped lots of people convert. In fact, one of my dear friends, his father saw The Exorcist when he was 21 and left the movie theater and ran to his nearest church and asked immediately to begin the process of becoming Catholic because he was so affected by it. So anyway, so that's the power of a movie, right? Terrifying it was. But exorcism is essentially the demon removal process as was originally developed by the Catholic Church. Jesus was, I will call him the original exorcist because obviously a tradition of exorcism expands beyond many traditions. So exorcism, I'm just going to generalize, would be considered a spiritual removal of entities from an individual. And it's rooted in the idea of exorcising out or removing, exorcising. And in the Catholic sense, it's about exorcising rights, removing the rights that a malignant entity, which we will of course refer to as demons here, has somehow gained. We can get into that. And the exorcist is, as Father Martin's always says, the job of the exorcist is not to cast out the devil. The job of the exorcist is to find out what rights has the devil gained. And then through the authority given to them in Christ, from the Christian perspective, those rights are rescinded and adios demonico. And that's how it goes there. But yes, there are exorcists, and there are Jewish exorcists, there are Islamic exorcists. There are people who just think they're exorcists going around in several cities. So it's a wide and diverse tradition.
So tell us about the Exorcist Files.
Well, there is an old saying that one does not choose to find the exorcism finds you. And by old saying, that's something I made up and trying to get it to catch on. But no, so I did not set out to do this. This is not something. In fact, a friend of mine the other day was he had my picture up on a presentation for a startup, completely unrelated to a company I was advising. And he said, someone in the room goes, "Hey, I know that's the demon guy." And I said, "Oh man, that's when your ubiquity of your brand needs to be changed." I did not set out to be the demon dude. But no, so I've always been fascinated with what I consider metaphysical phenomena. That's my LA way of saying things so people don't think you're crazy. It sounds cooler, like it's somehow grounded in science. But the reality is I'm very curious. The world is so full of inexplicable occurrences, and I love that. I want mystery. I'm a huge fan of the Goonies. I always want there to be an adventure or something unexplained, some treasure or magic ship I just want something out there. And I was fascinated because I had heard all these stories of miraculous healings. I was actually originally drawn to this because I had heard of many stories of documented healings, some of which were pretty remarkable and defied sort of, scientific law. Rare and not things that I could readily access. But interestingly, through that research process, I discovered that the Catholic Church has a process for investigating miracles when they canonize their saints. So if we're trying to get Brett's cause to be a saint approved, we have to have 2 miracles attributed to him. One's not enough. I mean, anyone can do a miracle, right? But 2 miracles, well, that's good. And so I discovered that it's an extraordinarily rigorous process. And not being Catholic myself, I was just shocked at this. And they actually have an entire team of doctors who have to actually evaluate the evidence and then decide that there's no other it's a physical, spontaneous healing with no other cause other than it just has to be a supernatural miracle. And so I really appreciated that. And I thought, that is fascinating. That would make a great show. There are challenges, though, when you're trying to document healings and miracles, because medical records are not things that people just, gladly give out, especially to young Protestants who just show up at the Vatican so relatively unannounced and try to, network their way in with some people, which I did. But they took pity on me and basically said, look, when I met with one of the priests over there, they said, look, it's going to be a really difficult process to get these medical records, and I would advise you to spend your time elsewhere. So let me point you in the direction of someone that we send some of our most intense exorcism cases to when spiritual warfare gets really rough. This is someone that I personally trust and recommend highly. Would you like to talk to him? And I said, like any good producer, when they are offered to be introduced to a genuine exorcist, I said, yes. Interestingly, he gave me his number. I called him. Father Carlos Martins, who is my co-producer and co-host on this, The Exorcist, he thought I was lying because I was from Hollywood and I just somehow found his phone number. So I don't remember exactly, but I think he hung up on me pretty abruptly. And it only wasn't until he discovered that I actually was referred to him by a really respected source that he took my call. And then after a few months of cajoling, begging, interceding, I said, look, you firmly believe that Ouija boards, the occult, psychics, mediums, ghost hunting, sorry, Brett, all those things are dangerous and you want the world to know about it, right? And he goes, yes. I said, let me help you tell that story. And thus began our journey. And it was a 3-year journey, and the show came out last year. And I can't prove this definitively, but by many metrics, I believe we were the #1 new Christian podcast in the country. We were on the charts for 40 weeks, #1 for at least, I think, a dozen. And it was really cool. It's been a huge success, and we're so grateful. And the stories are, I joke now that I'm not impressed anymore. Like someone's like, I have a cool God story or a cool ghost story. And I was like, try me. But no levitation, no crazy objects floating through the air, no strange dialects. Come on, don't waste my time.
I mean, I think you're exactly right. It's kind of hard to measure the popularity of a show because I think Apple kind of has their black box way of counting it. But I will say, when I was researching your show, you popped up on so many blogs. There was like CatholicMom.com, which, by the way, is like incredibly well read. But what I found really impressive was because your co-host, as you said, is a Catholic priest. This is based on real Catholic documented exorcism, but it's not a Catholic show. And the appeal is much broader, based on the reviews I've read online. I mean, it is just this is not a Catholic show. I mean, you're not Catholic, right? And so, with that said, if you listen to your show, it is steeped in what the Catholic Church's doctrine is, and it doesn't shy away from kind of the hard teachings about spiritual warfare. And a lot of things you say, I think in maybe mainstream documentaries or podcasts, people might just shy away from it, water it down, or just call it the paranormal. And you don't do that. Yet it has this kind of wide appeal beyond just the Catholic Church. Why do you think that is? Why do you think people who, may or may not believe in this faith are so drawn to these stories and drawn to your podcast and the way you tell it?
I think, well, it's funny. So, we mentioned the miracle investigation process. So the term the devil's advocate actually comes from that process because during the Protestant Reformation, there was so much backlash and questioning to the Catholic Church saying that, hey, y'all are just making up miracles to justify your position. And the Catholic Church, to its credit, has always presented skepticism and argued sort of for the alternative position, which is one thing I really appreciated. I did not realize it is so difficult to get an actual major exorcism, to get a true rite of exorcism performed. It is a process of bishop approval, doctor evaluation, psychiatric evaluation, because a genuine demonic possession, as they believe, is extraordinarily rare. And so I think a lot of people need to realize there is an immense amount of skepticism. In fact, most of the exorcists we interview on the show, they approach all their cases and assume right off the bat it is not a supernatural case because it is rare. So I think because we don't shy away from that skepticism, and because I play the role of sort of devil's advocate, and that role was created as a counter to the reformers saying, hey, no, we're going to appoint someone to actually point out how this could maybe not be a miracle, aka the devil's advocate. And so we wanted to actually take that into the show and say, well, Father, being a Catholic priest, can present his catechesis or teaching on spiritual warfare as the church presents itself. I can play the host of sort of a true crime skeptic and say, well, let's try and explain away laws. And I think we just did an episode on Eucharistic miracles, which is another fascinating topic that I had no exposure to being a Protestant. And you get into it, and there are some wild stories and some documented evidence of heart and flesh tissue being found integrated on these communion wafers, as we would call them in the Protestant church, and during the Eucharist being presented at Mass. And it's absolutely, I thought someone was like just pulling my leg on this. This is astounding. But yet on one of the first cases we did, we actually looked into it, and we brought on a PhD, Dr. Stacy Trasenkos. She's a PhD, practicing Catholic, and she was not afraid to say, hey, I don't think the evidence on this one necessarily points towards miraculous. And so we've taken that approach on these cases and said, look, we're going to try and argue all the reasons why you should say this is not a genuine reported demonic possession. And then at the end, you can decide. And, I think candidly, once you try and explain away some of the causes, you're left with there's either these things are real, or there's an extraordinarily large amount of people who are just making up stories that are awfully similar to each other cross-culturally, which, I don't know what to think about all of this, but these stories are just so incredible that I just, there's a credibility to Father's voice. That's the other thing too, is I would say when people listen to him, he's not afraid to say, no, that's hooey or that's this, but he goes, but when he speaks and he said, this is real, people listen. And I found that we've taken him out on the road for these evenings with an exorcist, present him to a bunch of audiences, and people always walk away. One of the biggest points of feedback I get is, wow, he's so convincing and convicted, because, they're not paid. Like exorcists, they're not out of commission. You don't get paid. You don't charge it. The church does not charge. This is a service and a gift to mankind, and an option that is available for those who find themselves, at the mercy of sort of supernatural oppression. So I find him very convincing. Obviously, I wasn't there, thankfully, for any of these cases.
Yeah. And before we get into some of the cases you guys have looked at, I'm curious, and I may be the only one, but, the church obviously is known for its hierarchy. You've talked about that a little bit, and the very bureaucracy might be another word to describe it to a certain extent. And also, I'm sure a little bit of skepticism towards someone such as yourself, who is not a member of the church, who all of a sudden wants to do something like this on an issue that is fascinating, but it's also controversial and also could be a source of mockery. I mean, you worry that in the wrong hands, somebody could take this and use it to mock the faith. So I'm curious, how did you gain the trust and the permission of the church to do this, but also the trust of the Father to agree to do this with you and share all this information?
Yeah, I think Father doesn't fear much. When your job is an exorcist, I think the only thing that really scares you at that point is Hollywood or the IRS, and probably less so for priests who live very modest means, right? So, but I think, one, it was building a relationship. It just took time. There's an immense amount of skepticism towards all, and me included. It took a long time for us to build and just, I think create a wonderful friendship. On the other hand, it's not a thing where the Vatican said, "Hey, Ryan, go make this," right? It was, I got to meet with some individuals who carried some, significant clout, and they referred me to him. So that helped, right? So I came in through someone who was very respected, and Father, because he's able to make all these cases anonymous, et cetera, is able to actually go out and talk about these things and prepare it as a catechesis of teaching, essentially. So for him, I think he would say that he wanted to do it as an offering to the church on like a curriculum on spiritual warfare, mainly because it's very hard to get people to sit through a church service, but there's a whole realm. For him, it's an enormous ministry. We kind of call it redemptive horror, where humans have this, and the same reason you can't look away from a car crash. Humans have this terrible, awful inclination to look at just disaster. And I think that's what has fueled exorcism content for so long, as being so interesting. And it's one of those interesting things where people are not religious at all, but it's funny. They're not religious. They might be completely agnostic, but they watch, The Exorcist, and they're utterly terrified, right? Because there's something so invasive, so insidious, right? And it hits, and I would argue it connects at a level where everyone, I think, at some deep down level keeps a pretty open mind that there's probably more spiritual activity than we recognize. I mean, I've read things that, 40% of Americans claim to have seen a ghost. I'm obviously talking with a former paranormal hunter. So I think there's enough possibility that it's real that gets people going there. And so the prospect of reaching those people through a podcast in particular was really interesting to him. And so we did have to navigate. We have to be very careful and do it very delicately. One of the biggest risks you have when doing this is that the topic even of the supernatural among Christians, or topic of the demonic, I should say, is actually one of a lot of controversy, which I find very interesting, because in the New Testament particularly, Christ does a lot of exorcism. In fact, one of the earliest stories, right, is there's a demon manifests while he's teaching in the temple. And I thought, this is so interesting. This is something that's just not talked about. And I don't know why that is. I really probably should do some research and find out. I don't know if it's because the rite was, misused, or if we became more scientific or whatever, but somehow it's funny. Angels, miracles, guardian angels, answered prayer, totally cool. Right. But the second you even acknowledge that there's another side, potentially, people get very stoic and like, oh, no, we're not gonna. It's like just there's a wall that goes up. And I think it's been to the detriment that a lot of people have not talked about this, because even if you say it's not real, you remember in the film The Exorcist, right? The doctors recommend exorcism to Chris because they said, look, well, it's not, it's placebo. It's not going to do anything, but it could work because the victim who thinks they're possessed will suddenly think they're free. So even if you think this is all made up and just hogwash, right, there still could be therapeutic benefit to it if that's your mindset. And so I think, all those factors allowed us to, create this thing, treat it like a journalistic investigation, and then not glorify it. That's the last big thing is, there's a big concern among people of faith that you don't want to glorify, you don't want to celebrate inadvertently by making it really scary and gratuitous. So how do you make it scary and authentic, but not go over the line? And honestly, I'm really proud of the line. I think we go right up to it of like, hey, yeah, I do get a lot of complaints, actually a lot, but I did get a lot of emails from sweet old ladies saying, I don't like the demons, how much the demons cuss. And I said, well, I'm so sorry, but, based on being, journalistically having integrity here, my research shows that demons do not say darn or gosh or gee golly. And no matter how many cool sound effects, it's not going to work there, right? And, we'll get into it, but actually that's a whole nother thing is when you write demonic dialogue, that is a very bizarre exercise and a fascinating character study. But overall, we're really thankful, and we've got a lot of endorsements, and we're really blessed with how it came out.
And you're kind of touching on this, but one of the really special things I think about your podcast is that you actually bring in, it's not just you talking or the father talking, but you actually have these voice actors who are acting out dialogue. And so my question to you is, did you write that dialogue? What is it based on? Are you basing it on actual dialogue, or is it kind of just trying to tell the story? And how did you decide to go that route with the sound effect? I mean, it really is like watching a 1950s sort of radio show, listening to, and it puts you right in the middle of the story, which is why for me, it was so scary. Like you were saying, going up to the line, because all of a sudden you're transported into the middle of the story as opposed to being told a story. So how did you decide to tell it in that manner? Because I don't think a lot of podcasts do that these days. How did you write that dialogue? What is it based on? How much of it is kind of true to what actually happened? Because like you said, you weren't there at the exorcisms.
Absolutely. No, I tell people too, the only thing scarier than the demonic stories is how expensive it is to do the kind of 3D audio that we do. So the 3D audio is an enormous production lift, and we did it in a really unique way. So we actually took a mic with ears. It looks like a Mr. Potato Head with ears, and we would move it around the room. So we went outside of the studio, and we were the victim. People always ask, what spiritual opposition did you face making it? And I said, leaf blowers and airplanes. Funny, I can't get Southwest to be on time for my flight. But I tell you what, when we were recording out in Burbank, every 15 minutes, there was not a missed flight out of Burbank Airport that day. And that's just, you don't notice all these sounds that are around you until you're trying to make something. And it'd be like 3, 2, 1, action. And I mean, it was like, one of my favorite lines is one of our actors, incredibly talented from the first episode. The character Cheryl is in a full possession, is finally manifested and runs out into the street screaming, "No life without death, no life without death." And that was recorded at a Airbnb in the Valley at like 10 p.m. at night. And I was getting so nervous because we had multiple takes and screaming and all in the middle of the street on this quiet little residential street. Lights start coming on. It's like, "No life without death." And it was even scarier. But no, so when I was a kid, my parents would put me in the back of the red 4Runner, and I'd sit in the back with a blanket and a pillow, and we'd turn on the old radio drama, like, The Shadow. Right. Yep. And you would hear the foil for the thunder, et cetera. And there's something, it's the same reason a book is so amazing. And, your favorite stuff, the movie can be amazing, but it's never as good as the book, because it's just, you have a vision in your mind. And that's what I love about those kind of old time radio. And now we have all this technology where we can I wanted to say, look, if we're going to do this, like, this old time radio with reenactments, right? And I really got to give credit to our producer at the time, Chandler Mays with iHeartRadio, who he really had this creative vision for, can he kind of walk me through like what we could do as far as the 3D sound? And I said, that would be amazing. And he did a phenomenal job. I mean, it's a masterclass in editing, but you listen to some of the episodes and you walk in and you'll hear Father narrates the story, and then it takes pauses to kind of draw you in, and you'll hear the demon in 360 around go like it's all circular, and it's so cool. In fact, we gave it to one of his priests that he lives with to listen to, and there's a scene where a door slams behind him, and it's all spatial behind audio, and he turned around thinking, "Oh my gosh, the door just shut." So that's really cool, and I think that really adds itself, to the show, and it draws you in. And there's lots of podcasts, and obviously this content would do well just with Father narrating, but we wanted to kind of level up and make it stand out. So the format is, and you asked about writing it, and so Father he basically has to change a lot of details and places, right? The core, sort of the soul of the story remains the same, but obviously we want to go through great lengths to protect the identities and the details of the victims. One, because you never want them to hear this and relive what they went through. Now, there are some exceptions in season 2 where we have permission from a few people in a different style to kind of walk through and talk about some of their stuff. And season 1, we actually share a testimony from the wife of a dear friend of ours who shares her testimony of chronic illness and then a manifestation of a demon and an exorcism. She was very open about it, and now is like totally fine talking about it. But generally, because some of the stories we're profiling are so extreme and so embarrassing, I always ask people, like, imagine like your therapy, just a general therapy session being broadcast on the internet, and how invasive that would be. It's like, I get offended when people are like, show me the tapes. Where's the evidence? And I'm like, can you imagine you are crawling on the ground like a snake, slithering, completely loss of your agency, blackouts, saying horrible things. I mean, just like hurting people. And you want that video somewhere out on just so you can satisfy the curiosity of lots of people. I understand the question, but like, it's extremely serious. And so Father will obfuscate details. And then once the brief is formed, and he will narrate like a couple pages of the story. And then we just kind of read it and we go, what would be an interesting scene to dramatize here, right? And so I co-wrote season 1 with Chandler, and you'll see there's a lot of millennial references in there, so you can definitely tell 2 mid-30s guys wrote it. There's definitely, based on some of the song lyrics, etc., you can see a bent towards millennials. But yeah, so sometimes there's dialogue directly, Father said, oh, make sure to include this line, like this was crazy. And then others, I mean, like the opening episode, right? What would you do if you walked in and your wife was chopping rats, right, in a full state of possession, right? What would you say? And so that's where, again, not to glorify, but it was fun to be able to say, all right, I hope I'm never in this position, but what would I say in that situation,
And I think one thing everybody out there who's listening should know is this is a podcast you can enjoy, whether you believe in this stuff or don't. You
Absolutely.
can be an atheist, you will enjoy this. I mean, if you enjoy well-produced stories that have a horrific aspect, you will enjoy this. Obviously, if you believe in exorcisms, if you're a person of faith, I think you'll find it incredibly interesting. But there's something in this podcast for everybody. Now, I do have a question. I know it's a question people will ask, and it's a question you often hear. And to the extent you can answer this, is probably a better question for the Father, but you have a lot of expertise in this as well. How, and you mentioned this earlier, that the Catholic Church has a long process you have to go through before an exorcism is approved. How do you distinguish an exorcism from a severe mental illness?
Yeah, so it's funny. We had Dr. Richard Gallagher. For those who find this topic really interesting in the interplay between mental illness and exorcism, Dr. Richard Gallagher is a very eminent psychiatrist, board certified, practicing in New York. I believe he teaches at Columbia. I think he graduated from Yale. I might be conflating those two, but a very, very smart guy. And I asked him that very question on episode 6, where we actually have him come on and actually share sort of his approach, because he's a psychiatrist. He evaluates patients for mental illness, and he firmly believes in the reality of the demonic and has multiple stories. His book, Demonic Foes, is very fascinating. But he said, look, Brian, I know the difference between mental illness and demonic possession. And I'm just going to give you a little sample. Mentally ill people don't wake up speaking fluent Aramaic, right? So unless they got a great Rosetta Stone subscription, but sponsorship. But so it's one of those things where the Catholic Church has particular signs they look for, right? That there are specific things, and all this is done for if Father's going to contend that someone needs an exorcism, right? There's a whole case that has to be gathered, et cetera. And I think it's important to know too that what we're talking about is the formal major exorcism, the rite. When you see, the film and you see them beginning and the power of Christ and the holy water, I mean, that's a whole process. There's an actual published rite. It's very specific, and exorcists perform that rite. But there's things called minor exorcisms, and in the Protestant community, this would be called deliverance prayers and deliverance ministry, where anyone can pray for someone. But to do the formal rite and to have that sort of power of the full church behind it, that needs to be granted bishop authority. And usually they will come forward and they will present a case and say, hey, here's why I have moral certitude that I think this person needs this. Some of your listeners may remember too from the movie The Exorcist, Father Karras is bending over backwards trying to justify this as just being a mental illness case. And he's trying to record her speaking a different language, and the demon actually stops speaking in other languages. And I think one of the fun ideas there is that the demon knows what evidence is required to get the exorcism. And so it knows how to go right up to the line and stop, right? But so some of the common signs, right? So superhuman strength, right? Father, many exorcists report these tiny ladies tossing these 300-pound men across the room, right? Knowledge of the unknown is a big one, right? So Dr. Gallagher shares this as well, where, mentally ill patients, right, are not going to be able to say, Alice, like you were at this spot last week doing this, et cetera. And the kind of thing where it's like seems to be reading your mail, right? speaking in unknown languages. It's very common. You'll have just, Father has one case where the demoniac was speaking a dead Norse language that only a handful of people on the planet knew. In fact, they wrote it down and sent it to an expert. I believe it was in Norway. And the expert said, how did you come across this? And is this about an exorcism? Because it's someone saying, help me, help me. It's very interesting. So those are kind of the three. It's interesting. The aversion to religious objects, that they weight less because anyone can feign that, right? But those sort of first three are things that are really difficult to make up. And so that in conjunction with a psychiatric evaluation is sort of what is required to say, okay, let's look at this and say, I don't think this is mental illness. One last point on that. There's an exorcist who joined, is a friend of Father's and colleague, Father John Zeta, the exorcist for the Diocese of Erie, Pennsylvania. Brilliant guy, great, 3-foot long beard, is the closest thing to Gandalf the Catholics have today. And he is also, in addition to being an exorcist and a priest, he has a PhD in psychology. And he shared something fascinating, which is that, it's not necessarily either or. The problem is most likely rooted in one or the other. But, if you have a spiritual worldview, the Christian worldview is that Satan owns the world, right? That the world is broken and slowly being redeemed as Christ's plan, is put into action for his church to redeem the earth. That, all elements of brokenness and illness and health are actually a result of some sort of demonic interplay. And the two also are not mutually exclusive, which is rather terrifying. We have an episode where an individual's dad abandons her and she suffers from legitimate schizophrenia, diagnosed mental illness. But demons don't play, according to Father, demons don't play nice. They don't say, oh, well, you know what? You already have mental illness. Let's just leave this one alone. It's no, actually, again, if they're real, you're dealing with an intelligence that says, maybe I'll obfuscate and hide behind this. People will think I'm crazy. It actually would be quite brilliant strategy is to actually prey on individuals who might suffer from that, et cetera. So it's a fascinating interplay. And I really respect and appreciate that they rely heavily on psychiatric evaluations before going through that. That being said, you can pray for someone and offer to help, pray for them. But to get the formal right, there's a process, and I'm thankful it's there.
So in the teaser to your podcast, and I've seen kind of across a lot of different podcasts talking about exorcism in general, is that there's kind of this shocking rise in exorcisms in the last, recent history for the church. And you've just gone through in great detail how, real demonic possessions are incredibly rare, and that in order to be approved to do an exorcism is a very long and arduous process. So is that in fact true? Are there more and more exorcisms today than there were in the time of Christ or anywhere in between the last 2,000 years? And if so, do you have a theory as to why that is?
I don't know. I don't think it's funny. I don't think Gallup has done any, epidemiological research on exorcisms in America, but basically what you're referring to in that video. So the Vatican put out an article, The Guardian covered this, and the Vatican mentioned this a couple years ago, which was that there's a significant increase in the number of reported cases of demonic possession. Obviously, we don't know if all those were legitimate, but yeah, it seems to be a general accepted truth that there is a rise in fascination with the occult and spirituality. Even last year, remember all the headlines? There was SatanCon. We had the record number of exorcism movies coming out. And there were 2 incidents of teenagers being hospitalized in Colombia after playing with a Ouija board. And from what I recall, there was no pharmaceutical cause or trace of that. So again, obviously don't know how to evaluate the veracity of those claims, but it seems that there's a general interest in that. Then you have witch talk, which is a hashtag on TikTok that encompasses a lot of stuff. But there seems to be just a general fascination. It's funny, as organized religion is probably, I believe, losing some of its numbers, there is an equal rise in fascination with just general spirituality, et cetera, which, doesn't surprise me. We're humans. I think most of us would concede that we're more than just flesh and bone, that there's something ethereal that makes us different, that makes us special, and humans, and there's an intangible thing. And so I think people are really fascinated with that right now. And so obviously, though, from a Christian perspective, psychics, mediums, sorcery, witchcraft, all that stuff, according to the Old Testament, big no-no. And as Father would say, is a violation of the first commandment, that thou shalt have no other gods than God, and as an attempt to actually usurp his sovereignty and authority. I think that's probably what's going on, that there's just a general fascination, and people are not aware of the dangers of this. In fact, even just this morning, Father was answering some questions on why is it so bad, and why is the Catholic Church so specific that you should not go to psychics and mediums when people have had generally really authentic experiences. And interestingly, he says, I don't doubt that. It's like, I have many people who have had emotional, like powerful experiences, things that came, like they got convinced. And he goes, I believe you. I absolutely believe you. But he's like, the psychic doesn't have to lie to you for it to be a sin. They could tell you the truth, and you're still breaking a covenant that God made with his people and violating the commandment. And as the show teaches, right, demons come in through doorways. The standard MO is you don't have demons. That's not supposed to be the case, right? But they get in through sin and trauma. And we can get in a little more into that. But that's where I think what's happening right now is if more people are dabbling in the occult, then that would necessarily lead to a rise in those reported cases.
So you've obviously done a lot of these shows now. Which one would you say frightened you the most?
So scariest, I mean, it's like you love all your children equally, but the scariest case, I think for a lot of people, it's going to depend on what hits home for them the most, right? They might have had a similar experience. I've had many, many people write in and say the Ouija board episode, just because everyone seems to know someone who had that experience. I mean, that one is just, I think, crazy. I don't want to spoil it, but like there's a man with no face in a cornfield. So tune into that one, see what happens there. But I think if I reflect on it, I think one of the scariest ones is actually the case I mentioned about the girl with schizophrenia, because if you had legitimate mental illness and demonic oppression on you, that would just be so difficult. And there'd be so much opportunity for them to really mess with your head. And they did. Like in that episode, the demons came back and manifested as her departed father. So they preyed on a wound that she had. She was abandoned by her father and so lonely. And that's the thing, like you really have a heart for some of these people. You know, there's an episode that came out a few weeks ago. Father Dan Rehill, the exorcist in Tennessee, shared a story of a grieving widow, and a spirit appeared that claimed to be her husband, looked like him, talked like him, etc. And you can imagine in a state of grief if that happened, and you would like, oh my gosh, is this a gift from God that this person I loved is like here to encourage me, etc. And he said, hey, can I just come cuddle with you? And she's like, of course, right? And that's all they need is that, one, and I'll just say yes, right? And then I won't spoil it, but it progressed, and it turned out, spoiler alert, in one case, that was not her husband. And interestingly enough, I've had a dear friend of mine in Georgia shared a story awfully similar, where a deceased grandma visited his daughter, and the exact same thing happened, where it started off as just this sort of gentle, loving, and then the daughter was like, grandma visits me at night. And he goes, what? And he goes, yeah, at night, right? And he goes, all right, well, it's a kid, they see things, whatever, right? And then one night, grandma attacked me. Grandma had fangs, right? And that's when you got to pray grandma gets runs over by a reindeer. So,
wow. Oh my gosh. Well, if the hairs on the back of your neck aren't rising right now, I mean, and this is just like the tip of the iceberg.
Love you, Grandma.
Yeah, no kidding. There is so much to talk about. I mean, I will ask this. So these particular exorcisms that you highlight, are they all conducted by Father Martins, or has he polled his other exorcist priest friends and gotten their stories?
So most of the cases, 80% of them are him and obviously we're dramatizing some of the backstory too. One of the cool liberties you can take is, sometimes by the time someone gets to him, they're recounting what happened prior to him meeting them. And obviously we will dramatize that to the best of our ability, but we don't know like exactly, we're going off what the victim said happened, because by the time it reaches usually Father Martins, it's usually pretty bad. Interestingly though, some of them also are just, routine people call and say, hey, come bless my house. And then you find out, oh, there's a little more to it. Like, well, house blessing's normal, but oh, there's stuff going on in the house. Tell me more about that. Right. And then they tell their story. So yes, most of the cases was Father directly. We do share an interesting vignette about, this was really cool. This is one of my favorite moments in the season. Dear friend of his had contributed a story. And at the time we didn't know if he would be able to participate and actually come tell. So we created a composite character. We said, hey, we're going to call him Father George. And it was a story about a relic and a demon. And this is my favorite episode. It is episode 5. And this demon identified itself as murder. And this demon had claimed to have murdered the Catholic saint, St. Thomas Becket. And Father had actually come into possession of a relic of St. Thomas Becket and had sent this relic to Father George, who was performing the exorcism, who then applied it to the demon's forehead. And yeah, you're going to tune in for that one. It's the best audio engineering too of the season. It's absolutely phenomenal. So then we got news shortly after we released that episode. It was a terrifying episode. Is that Father George was his alias, but that priest, Monsignor Brinken, was actually able to join us from Oklahoma. And he came on and commented on the story. And so we played it for him. And I said, did we get it right? And he's like, yeah, there's one big difference. And I was like, what? He's like, it's far scarier than what you had. Right. And it was scary. Right. So that was cool to be able to say that. So we do share other stories from other priests that Father is potentially involved with, because obviously you never go in the room alone. And oftentimes these exorcists will collaborate with each other. They'll discuss cases like doctors, right? They'll discuss. I don't want to distill it down to best practices, but they do have things where they they'll talk relics and strategies, and it's a really fascinating art and science, because there's a right and there's got formal guidelines and there's a process, but it's also highly spirit led, and they're listening and they're praying and they're trying to find out. It's a detective work. It's trying to find out what rights has this demon gained? And, victims aren't always forthcoming. Like, have you told me everything? It's like, yeah, everything, right? Well, it's still there. I don't know what to do. Also, interesting anecdote is Father shares in that episode is their favorite tradition after a long, arduous day of exorcism is they go out and they grab margaritas at a noisy Mexican restaurant. And can someone say Camarones al Diablo? So.
That sounds like
imagine the waiter there.
A bad day.
Can you imagine the server coming over, and just seeing a group of exorcists?
I can't imagine. It'll be an interesting day at the margarita shop.
I'll tell you a funny story too about when making it. We filmed that promo you saw, Alice, on Halloween 3 years ago, and it was a last minute. It was Halloween. Like, we're in LA. Where are we going to get dinner? But thankfully it was around 9 p.m. And I think a lot of people had kind of already gone out for their Halloween festivities. So we found a really nice sushi restaurant over in Hollywood, right? And somehow we got in, and the place had just decorated itself. I mean, the glass case where all the sushi was filled with skulls and like gummy worms. They did a really, really clever Halloween setup. All the staff was in costume. A very nice place, really fog machines, lights. I mean, it was awesome, right? And we came straight from set, and Father is wearing his collar, right, and his priestly attire. And so we sit down, and the host says, "All right, your waiter will be right with you." And the waitress comes over, and she's dressed as Lucifer, Satan, with a name tag that says Lucy and horns and the devil. And she goes, "Oh my gosh, I love your costume, Padre."
Padre.
And he looks at her and goes, "Hello, Lucy. It's good to see you again." And she had no idea that she was speaking with one of the leading exorcists in America. And I thought, man, if that's not proof of God's sense of humor guiding this whole thing, I don't know what is.
I was going to ask you this. We've got an audience. We love our audience because it, as Alice said, every possible background. We got people who will hear this and they will run to listen to your podcast because they truly believe in this, and you're not going to have to convince them. But we're also going to have people who are extreme skeptics, who don't believe in God or demons or any of this stuff. So what would you say to those folks who say, I think this is all just a bunch of hogwash?
So like in a Dave Matthews way, what would I say? All right. See, my millennial just creeps out there.
Can't help
For your
it.
young listeners, Dave Matthews is not a saint in the church. He is a 90s/early 2000s very talented musician. Still very talented. All right. So the question is, what would I say to people who think this is just a bunch of hogwash? I hear you. I know it sounds bonkers. I say all the time, I'm 90% Christian. And that doesn't mean I obey 90%. If it's by obedience, I'm probably closer to 70%, right? We all fall short. But I say that in the sense that could we all be living in a simulation right now that somehow is controlled by Elon Musk and Bill Gates? Sure. Could we be creations of UFOs coming to check up and be like, all right, guys, we got to pull the plug. This experiment's getting out of hand, right? Absolutely. There's a mystery there. Could we be wrong? Absolutely. No one knows. Really think about this. It's just start for the Christianity to have a guy walk on water and turn water into wine and base your life on a book that was assembled over thousands of years, and that the earliest documented, like handwritten testimony of what this guy did was like 50 years after like he allegedly died and rose again, right? I know it absolutely, it sounds crazy. I get it, right? For me, it's only slightly crazier than the idea that we exist at all, that some big, like there was nothing. And then one day, pow, everything just came into being. And suddenly we're in this like finely tuned universe that like has gravity and works. And we have like oxygen and we are evolved and talking. It's just not that much crazier than what you actually believe already. I would posit that, right? It's also not that much crazier. I mean, you have government reports now of UFOs, and some of this footage is absolutely bonkers, right? It's only slightly crazier than that. So we're really on a spectrum here. We're not that crazy. The last thing I would submit to you, and this is the big stuff, right? So if you do not live in the United States or sort of Western Europe, right, and affiliated territories, the idea that there is a supernatural reality is the consensus. There are 2 billion Christians on the planet. I think just under 2 billion Muslims on the planet, right? However many people of the Jewish faith. If you take just the Abrahamic faiths alone, right? There is a consensus among so many people that there are angels and demons running around doing stuff. I find it interesting. Every culture on earth has a prescription and a narrative for what to do about evil spirits, right? From yetis and dragons and leprechauns and abominable snowmen. I just find it interesting. How is it that all these cultures, like malignant spirits is a thing, right? Every faith tradition has some sort of shaman, healer, or exorcist that needs to be used to get rid of evil spirits, right? Or some ritual or something. So again, is everyone wrong, right? Also, you have people like Dr. Richard Gallagher, right? Dr. Josh Brown, neuroscientist, right? Are all of these people crazy? These are doctors, like learned doctors who will share their stories. And I encourage everyone to listen and go, you tell me, like, what's the consensus? Like, they're all wrong. Every single one. Say you throw out most of the probabilities, right? They're all wrong. And think about this. People say, show me the tapes. Like, why don't the demons reveal themselves, right? Why would they, if they are real, right? Just granting, if these things are real and the Christian narrative is true, that they somehow, these eternally damned creatures that basically are going to one day forever leave, but somehow for this brief moment in our time can find a respite in a human host, like a parasite, right? They can find some brief respite from their eternal torment by occupying a human host, right? And when they are revealed, that there is 100% effective way to get rid of them, right? That it's by the Bible says that Jesus has authority over all evil spirits, right? That's partly why they followed him, because they're like, oh my gosh, this guy, like demons listen to him. This is crazy, right? So if that was true, why would these things, to satisfy your curiosity, appear and do tricks and juggle and like show them stuff, right? If anything, they're like cockroaches, right? You shine a light on it, they would run into the corner and hide. They have no vested interest in revealing themselves, because if they do, it's going to be dealt with and taken care of. The irony of that, though, is, right, because they're cut off from God and they're eternally, according to the tradition, they're eternally rebellious and full of hate and anger. It blinds them. And so when they do manifest, it's out of arrogance and pride. And it's because there's a whole, and this might even be another episode, there's a whole demonic psychology to get into, or provoking demons to make errors and like reveal themselves. But generally speaking, if there was a creature like that, why would it reveal itself? When as soon as it does, think about this too. Satan, there's that old quote, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing you he didn't exist. If one of your best friends that you know and trust, like their mental faculties are sharp, started slithering on the floor and speaking Norse, right? And objects started levitating through the air. And then someone walked in and says, in the power of Christ, I cast you out. And they got instantly better. Do you think that would increase church attendance? Probably would. At least you would be in church a lot quicker than, I guarantee you, the next Sunday, you'd be in church probably, right? So think about that when people say like, oh, is this, where's the evidence, all that stuff, right? It's just, if they're real, they may not play by your rules, etc. But I encourage everyone, do your own homework on this, right? Dig into it, look at the cases, look up John Zeta or Father Zeta, look up Dr. Richard Gallagher, read his book, and then just decide. And, have half of America seen a ghost? Is it really that crazy that demons are real? I don't think so. So that is my closing argument on that. I don't know if that's convincing, but I didn't hear any objections. So,
I mean, I'll say this, the people who listen here, we typically do true crime, but everything you've described about why demons would want to evade detection is precisely what we deal with every day in our investigations into crimes, right? The criminals are trying to evade detection, they're trying to mislead, and they're trying to essentially continue to be able to do what they do. And the only way they can do that is to not be cast out by being prosecuted and shut away. And so you kind of just shift your language a little bit, but this is more universal, right? This is something that we see certainly in so many sectors. But like you said, when you add this spiritual element to it, it is very interesting because at least, we like to talk about the law and the judicial system, and there are certain things that are set that everyone is supposed to follow. Whether you follow them or not, is another question. But what you're introducing that I think, is really mind blowing, and why your podcast is such an interesting listen, is that there's not a set of rules that you can force upon, the spiritual realm. And what exactly are those rules? I mean, I think we can begin to understand them across the different stories that you tell. But, we write the laws here that we decide to abide by. We don't write the laws of the spiritual realm. We could talk for another hour, but I want to make sure that you have a chance to talk about what's coming next for Exorcist Files. And, is there anything that we can do to help?
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you for having me. And obviously, make sure you stay away from Ouija boards per father's advice. There's no, stick to Monopoly, but be careful. Greed is also a sin. So, be good. Maybe Chutes and Ladders is better. Chutes and Jacob's Ladder. Yeah. So we actually, season 2 is imminent. It's coming, or imminent, I should say. It's coming, and probably, I'm going to guess, about 2 months. We're very excited. The next batch of cases are equally as riveting, and while unfortunate for those who were afflicted, but fortunate for our listeners, the devil is never short on material to work with, and he's hard at work. So we definitely have some more stuff to get into, and we're really going to get into a lot of that, sort of the psychology of the tactics that these things use. So I'm really excited, and it's been fun to write them. So they're almost done, but we are going to be raising some finishing funds on a Kickstarter. So we are doing we right now have a Kickstarter that's basically, you can go for a pre-launch right now, go to exorcistfiles.tv. You can sign up. There are going to be exclusive rewards only available on the Kickstarter. So if at all you want anointed exorcistic merchandise, this is the place. We've got sweatshirts that say same day deliverance. We've got special rosaries. Thank you. So I like that one too, right? We've got mugs. You name it. There's all sorts of cool gear out there. And so we're excited. You can only get it if you participate in our Kickstarter when it goes live. So depending on when this comes out, just go to exorcistfiles.tv, click that button for the Kickstarter, and help us. We just need to raise some finishing funds. The show is extraordinarily expensive to make, and obviously every little bit helps since we went independent. And so a lot of benefits to going independent, but 3D sound ain't cheap. And guys, I'm trying to give you the top. I want grade A talent for the demons. I ain't doing no C+ actors for the demons, right? We got to get the good ones there. And there's some new languages this time too. So I gotta, the demons who speak other languages, cost a little more, right? So, but yeah, please go listen to it. And if it blesses you, share it with a friend. But I just want everyone to do your homework on this, right? Don't take our word for it. Do a thing. And I also want to say that, a lot of people say, I don't want this to be true. And I say, no, you do want it to be true, because if these things are real, right, and this Christian narrative is true, then at a sheer math level, they're outnumbered 2-1. Tradition holds that a third of the angels fell with Satan. So at the very worst, that old angel on your shoulder, technically it should be 2 angels on your shoulder and 1. So you're covered, right? But you don't need to be afraid, because if this is true, if what Father is sharing happens to be the actual reality of the universe, then they're defeated. There is a chief exorcist who has authority over all these things, and he gave that authority to his disciples and those who are baptized. And so they actually have the authority. In fact, remember that scripture, he sends out the apostles and they come back, and the first thing they're like, Jesus, this is crazy. The demons submit to us. Like, isn't that amazing? And he's like, yes, that's cool, but that's not the main thing. Rejoice that you're saved, not that, but that is awesome. I know, Peter, that's awesome. So that's something to rejoice in. So it doesn't need to be scary. It just needs to be something like, hey, don't mess with evil forces. And, I think you look around the world, and it's not just Christians saying that. There's every culture on earth probably has a cave that you don't go into, a board you don't touch, a spell you don't say. And that comes from somewhere, right? It probably comes from somewhere. So I think there's compelling evidence.
Yeah. And like you said, we are always saying to people, the more, no matter what, and what you are at least documenting, whether you believe the spiritual realm of it or not, these things really did happen to real people. And I think that's a really great way to put it, and a great pitch. Before we sign off, we talked about, a wide variety of things, but is there anything you want to talk about before we sign off for the day?
Well, we have a former paranormal investigator. I'm going to call Brett, the prosecutor, to the stand, right? And I want you to solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, before I ask you if you ordered the code red, all right, I do want to know, right? Are you one of the 40% of Americans who says they have seen a ghost? I mean, you tell me, you investigated, you've had empty batteries, but what have you seen, Brett? Do I sound crazy, or do you think there's a little morsel of truth here that I'm dispensing?
So I've done all the things that you're not supposed to do. I've done the Ouija boards and the ghost hunting and all that stuff. And the people that I used to do this with would always say that I had dead eyes. And that's not a good thing. That's not like I saw the dead. It was that I would walk into a room and basically all the paranormal activity would stop. So I'm not sure what that means, but I went into it hoping to see ghosts and all the other stuff, and just really didn't have that many great experiences. Though weird things did happen. You and I talked about while Alice was having her technical difficulties tonight, the experience of having batteries, like putting new batteries into equipment, walking into a place that's supposedly haunted, and all of a sudden the batteries are dead. Just little things like that were always fascinating to me. Doors closing that shouldn't close, that kind of thing. But no, I have never actually seen a full-bodied apparition, as they say in Ghostbusters, unfortunately. But maybe fortunately, I don't know. Maybe I'm changing my view on this. Maybe it's a good thing that I never had anything like that happen.
Well, it is a good thing, because you don't want this to happen. I will say, when we were making this, we had some really interesting stuff happen. In fact, the very first day we started recording in Detroit, the power went out. Literally the second we hit start, right? It's become a common thing. Actually, I would encourage your listeners to look up the movie Nefarious, which was kind of a sleeper hit. I don't say horror, but it's a thriller that kind of profiles a psychological battle between a demoniac who is masquerading as an insane, death row inmate, and a psychologist. So it's kind of like a play. Did very well last year. And father was actually involved in an exorcism of the hotel room. There was so much stuff that happened, with footage being deleted, car accidents. In fact, I would go to YouTube and look up the story of nefarious, like, demonic activity, and see what happened, and just be like, is this crazy? Is this what's going? Are all these people crazy? So, but we had our own sort of share of that stuff. We actually had a friend who, in the process, was alone one night, and then there were 3 loud knocks on a door while they were in a room, and it went, and then just the room just getting like super cold, right? And all by themselves, no one there. And then, so theories of the 3 knocks, like a mocking of the Trinity. Who knows? I mean, it's scary. So, it's all makes for a good story. So I said, look, I hope that doesn't happen, but if it does, it's great material for your book, play, screenplay, whatever you got. So don't worry about that. But yeah, I don't know. It is a weird world to live in. I think the world is a lot weirder than we realize. And let's go. Let's keep a little mystery, right? Wouldn't it be boring if we had it all figured out?
Absolutely. 100%. Absolutely. Ryan, this has been, our listeners know how I literally flee this type of conversation. So it says a lot about how much I like your work that I have sat through this terrifying conversation. But you guys, you have got to check out Exorcist Files. Even I listened to it. So it's not too scary for you, because, like we said, the more you know. And it is some of the best kind of, like you said, 3D sound you'll ever hear in storytelling. And also go check out the Exorcist Files Season 2 Kickstarter. Let's get Season 2 underway now that they are independent. And Ryan, thank you so much for being with us today. And I foresee a lot more conversations, probably between you and Brett, and I might just hide in the corner while you guys have those paranormal conversations.
Oh, Alice, you're Catholic, right? And you know your scripture, right? Has the Lord given you a spirit of fear, or of power and of strength and of a sound mind? So you just quote that scripture. You just tell that thing.
All of those things, but he also gave me some fear.
Well, they did say fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So, a little fear's Little fear is good, little
There
tears
you
for fear is
go.
also good. So,
I love it. I love it. Well, this has been a delightful conversation. Guys, go check it out. And this has been kind of a different legal briefs, but I think there's a lot of intersectionality with the things that we talk about all the time with, mental illness and kind of the lines between the unsolved and the unknown and maybe the unknowable. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Sorry, can you hear me?
There you
Oh,
go.
there we go.
That was weird.
That was exactly what you just talked about, Brett. That's
There you
terrifying.
There you go.
I don't like this. Ryan, you should know between me and Brett. So Brett, hunts the paranormal and the terrifying things in life. I run from them. And so of course that would have just happened. So those of you who are listening at home, I was in the middle of talking and my mic just shut off.
That has never happened. Usually I'm the one with
No.
technical
It really has never happened. This has been happening to Brett because he got a new computer and software was incompatible. But I just want you guys to know that was not planned. If you're watching this, I'm very freaked out right now. I don't like that 3D shadow behind you, Ryan. So, Brett, why don't you take over questioning right now because I'm freaked out.
As Alice was asking,